Well, if I were visiting from another planet, I would swear that our culture is just sort of absolutely taken with murder. It seems like half the shows on television are about murder or crime dramas. I'm pretty sure that Law and Order was on in Old Testament times, and sometime in the New Testament, CSI started, and now we're finally CSI, I think, is going off the air or went off the air, but there's like NCIS Albuquerque. I don't know. And then you go, well, that's just television. That's old media. But the largest podcast ever was Serial, based on a murder. And then we have To Make a Murderer on Netflix. I mean, crime novels. There's a lot of murder going on in our entertainment. And it's not just that. I mean, we know the names of famous murderers, even Jack the Ripper, which was, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And we all, if we're over about 30, remember when OJ totally didn't kill his wife. I mean, we know it's just in our culture everywhere. And so I want to talk to you about the oldest crime drama of all, even older than Law and Order. And you probably know these names. If you grew up in Sunday school or you grew up in church, you know the names Cain and Abel, the two bad brothers we know. So the first two brothers. But I became taken with this story a while ago. I was thinking about this story and sort of rereading it, and I heard a talk about them, and it just struck me that what's really different about the story of Cain and Abel is not just the fact you go, if you trace the family tree of humans, according to the Bible, back to Adam and Eve, their two kids, there was a murder in the first family. That's your traditional biblical family. I love when people say that, like, hey, I believe in a traditional biblical family. And I go, so do I, but they were horrible. And so literally there's a murder in the first family. But also what we're going to talk about this month is not just, this is not exactly a murder mystery. I'm glad that Mitch threw in Perp and Vic. I like saying that. It makes me sound like a cop. But we know who done it. There was a witness, God himself, pretty unimpeachable witness. It's a bad day when God is the witness of a murder. But there's this part of the story that we're going to talk about that's really interesting to me, is the fact that God sort of enters into this story. Because a lot of times we spend time sort of connecting the dots. I was speaking to someone a few weeks ago, and they didn't know I was a preacher, so they were telling me all these horrible things, which is fun. And I didn't tell them at the end, I'm a man of God, because that would be weird. But they were telling me all of these horrible things they were involved in. And then they said, just totally unrelated, but yeah, I've got a little legal problem now, and I'm broke because of this DUI. And they're telling me all these things, and I'm like, all I wanted to do is go, can you connect the dots? And if they were in my family, or I knew them better, or definitely if it was a child, I would have said, you realize these two things are connected. But it's sort of amazing that you and I sort of go through life going, here's a sort of a sin that people do or I have done, and it leads to this bad situation. But this is a time in the Bible that I think is so interesting, that God himself sort of has that conversation with Cain. And so we're gonna not just sort of guess how to connect these dots. God himself sort of shows up and talks to Cain about his crime, and I find that fascinating, and we're gonna learn a lot this month. So sort of I feel like we need a sort of a snappy theme song. That would be nice, because every crime drama has one. We don't have one yet. But we're just going to dive in this week into this first investigation, if you will, of Cain and Abel. It's found in Genesis 4, 1 through 5. And it starts a little weird, but stay with me. It says, now Adam had sexual relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant. And when she gave birth to Cain, she said, with the Lord's help, I have produced a man. And later she gave birth to his brother and named him Abel. And when they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, and while Cain cultivated the ground. And when it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best portions of the firstborn lambs from his flock. And the Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gift, and this made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected. Now let's start right at the top, because this is a weird way to start. You hardly ever see this in a birth announcement. I think Mitch put this in his birth announcement, but he was just bragging, we sort of know that's true, but it's weird that it starts out going, now Adam had sexual relations with his wife, and she became, yeah. We get that. Now, if you're just thinking that's just sort of some weird going, like Moses is working blue all of a sudden, think about this. This is the first child born from natural causes. And if you think about Adam, story of Adam and Eve, Adam created by God, Eve created by God. I would even say, and this is just totally my conjecture, we find a lot of other people very soon in Genesis, and people go, well, how did they get there? Are they all brothers and sisters? How come? It can't be true because the Bible just talks about Adam and Eve. My guess, and this is just the Don record guess, is that God created some more of them as well, but this is the story of the first naturally born child, because Eve says, oh my goodness, now I'm in the man creating business. And so that's important to know. Like, this is the first child. And it's interesting because this should make you feel better about your parenting skills if you've got somebody you're a little worried about in your family. The first child grew up to be a murderer, which is kind of what we're all not going for, right? Like, you can think maybe they grew up to be a mime, that would be terrible, but a murderer, I know now everyone's a mime in here. I don't know, like a telemarketer or whatever, but like murderer worse, all right? So that's the first. Now, another interesting thing about this, and this sort of shows, and I'm just kind of interested in this because the very first family, you notice that when they grew up, they were very different, that they went into different professions, like Abel's a shepherd and Cain is a farmer. And that's also interesting to me. Like, I come from a very large family. I have 6 brothers and sisters. We're all so different. It's so amazing. Like, I shouldn't say we all, like 4 of us look alike, and 3 of us, or 2 others look like mom, and then I got 1 brother, and he doesn't look like anybody, and we're not sure about that, like how'd that happen? And we're all very different, and we have very different views, and it's just amazing, like, even how, like, coming from the same mom and dad, just how very different. And that's what happened here. Hello? Gunshots. That's what I was thinking. Like, they're punking me with the gunshots. Are we going to get this back up, or I'll just keep talking? Anyway, let's step out here. It's very, 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 very different. Is that going to come back up, guys?
Doesn't sound like it.
How about the other one?
Shots fired. That was all part of it. So I'm just going to talk, all right? But anyway, very different, and they actually started different professions. And I think that's kind of cool how God created people with different interests, and it actually works together for good. Because had they both been shepherds, vegetarians would have been very unhappy. And had they both been farmers, I would have had nothing to eat. So I think that's cool. Anyway, and then notice this point. It says, when it came time for harvest, Cain presented some of his crops, and Abel also brought a gift, the best portions of the firstborn lamb. Now, a lot has been made about this, because if you notice, like, their first harvest, it says they brought to God, and there's been way too many sermons and way too many, like, theological arguments over, God demands a blood sacrifice, or God, or Cain didn't bring the tithe, and all of those things are sort of ridiculous if you think about it, because none of that stuff had been instituted yet. I mean, you think about it, like, the tithe hadn't been instituted yet, sacrifices hadn't been instituted, but still, all of these guys knew that God owned the world and that they would bring something back to sort of say thank you for the increase that they had. Now, if you notice, like, I think the key words of this story are not that, and some people have made this like, well, Cain brought vegetables, and I don't know, God's anti-vegetarian vegetable, you know. God's not a vegetarian because he didn't like that. That's the way some people made it. And, you know, somehow he likes tasty barbecue lamb, which is delicious, but that's not the point. I think the point is, and I think the key words in here are that Abel brought the best, it says the best of the firstborn, and Cain brought what? Some of the crop. So both of them believed, both of them believed that, it's going to freak me out if that happens again, I'll admit, but perfect during the Murder One series, shots fired. That's pretty awesome. But anyway, Cain brought some of his crops, and Abel brought the very best and the first. Now, this principle shows up all through Scripture. And let's just kind of go behind the curtains. This is Action Church, and I'm just going to tell you something about Action Church, because I will say this, you've probably not heard me talk a lot about giving financially, other than at the end where we say invite, invest, and get involved. And there's a purpose to that. I will tell you that, because we're going to talk about like the gifts that were accepted and not accepted. I believe in America 2016, or even when we started back in 2007, one big hurdle that people have with churches is they go, hey, it's all about the money, they want my money, and they're all about, you know, whatever. So we sort of tried to take away that hurdle for new people who would come to Action Church. That's the whole purpose, that we have the giving boxes out front. We don't pass a offering plate. We never have, we never will. And guess what? God has blessed us, we're doing fine. So this is not about getting more money or getting, but here's the thing, I still think it's important. Another reason that we don't talk about it a lot is simply because I'm not certain there is as much of a like hard and fast rule in the New Testament as some people think. Like, I will just, full disclosure here, my family, we give 10% of our money up front to Action Church. And I'm not paid by the church, so I don't feel bad about talking about giving, because it doesn't go to my salary because I don't have one. So having said that, the reason why we don't talk about that a lot is I think in Scripture, in the New Testament, what we see is this idea of giving the best and the first, which is actually probably, as much as people like to talk about giving a tenth or the tithe is the hardest thing to do, the New Testament standard's actually a little higher. You know, like literally they gave whatever they had to help others. We find in the New Testament, they're like selling their property and giving it to each other. So when someone talks about a biblical standard of giving, I'm sort of like, which one? And I choose, as a family, we just feel like honoring God is for us to give that 10% first. But I don't talk about that because I'm not certain that's the rule. And so there's a lot of things like that. Like, I don't drink alcohol, we homeschool, I have politics to the right of Rush Limbaugh, and we don't talk about any of those things because I'd rather talk to you about the great news of Jesus, and I don't want to be a distraction in any of those areas. But I say that this morning because this standard starts in Genesis and goes all through Scripture, and it's very important. And it's not about the money, and it's not about, and I know right now you're like tense, like, oh, I knew this talk was coming. Like, it's been the long con for 8 years to try to talk about this. Yeah, that'd be a terrible plan. We would have gone out of business a long time ago. But I just want you to notice that this whole conflict starts because Abel brings the best and the first, and God accepts it, and Cain brings just some of, and I know you're also going to say, yeah, but Abel got killed, so maybe I should just be, anyway, so here's the way, I just want to talk about giving really quick, because I think it's a great time to talk about giving in this series. This is not what the series is about, but just in this moment, because it's tax season. So you've either just done your taxes, or if you're a procrastinator, you still haven't done and you're worried about it because it's coming up soon, and this is your reminder. So if you have sort of planned ahead and you give the best and the first, I will bet you will say this at the end of the year. I know we say this as a family. We're like, ooh, I can't believe it was that much. It's amazing. And tax season is a weird time because tax season is the only time that you wish you had made less and given more. Isn't that weird? Like, that's the only time. The rest of the time you want to give less and make more. Believe me, I know. That's the way my heart is. But if you haven't done that, this is just a self-test. This isn't me prying in your business. I've told you what we do. I've told you the reason why I don't preach about that, because I think this is really something there's an area where you have to deal with this with God. My guess is if you don't do that, if you don't plan ahead, if you don't give something every week, if you don't kind of go the first of whatever and we made a plan, you will be surprised how little it is at the end of the year. And the reason why, and I'll just tell you this and then we're going to move on. Like, honestly, all of us feel like we get asked to give all the time, don't you? Like, everybody's got a Kickstarter, everybody's got some sort of charity thing, every church needs money, and so we feel like, well, I give all the time. But when we give out of emotion and we give just out of need and, hey, this person asked, and we kind of do that, it doesn't ever turn out to be as much as we thought. So you can kind of look at your taxes this year and go, how did I do on that? Did I give God the best and the first, or just some of? Because here's the deal. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about the tithe from the Old Testament or you're talking about the early Christians giving what they had to help others. It was always based on this one idea that we honor God by giving him the best and the first, not the leftovers. So now here's the thing about that. It made Cain very angry when God told him that. And so if you're angry at me this morning, oh, you're a little like Cain. I'm just saying. But it's amazing. Like, that thing made Cain angry, that God didn't accept his gift and he accepted Abel's gift. Now, I will tell you, I understand that. I don't know why, but this, like, and some of you are generous. Like, it's funny, like, I think it's sort of a generous gene. I do not have it. My wife has it. But I struggle with this so hard. In fact, I lost an argument just in the last few months. And my argument was this: that's not income, so we shouldn't have to give off of that. That's horrible. And I'm the pastor, and I was saying that. And my wife's just like, really? You're saying that? And I'm like, I'm horrible. So I struggle with this, and it made me angry, and I lost the argument. But if you notice that God did say, no, I don't want your leftovers, Cain, but Abel, I accept. And I just want to point this out to you, because don't get hung up on this part of the story or what I've said about giving. God cares about their hearts, and he cares about our hearts. Do you really think that God needed a couple lambs? He created the entire thing. And it wasn't like, oh, I don't like the barley you brought me. Bring some hops and we'll make some beer, Cain. But I mean, it's like, God doesn't care about the stuff. God doesn't need my money. God doesn't need your money. God doesn't need your stuff. But God cares about our hearts, whether we put him first and we give him the best and the first, or if we sort of go, oh, by the way, if I have extra, God, because that's not honoring to him. So moving ahead, that's what set up the conflict. What set up the conflict is a thing that all of us struggle with. Like, do we give God the first and the best, which is hard, or we kind of give God the leftovers? So God speaks to Cain, and I'm so glad we get to kind of listen in to this story. It says, why are you so angry? The Lord asked Cain. Why do you look so dejected? You'll be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. You must subdue it and be its master. And then one day Cain suggested to his brother, let's go out into the fields. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother and killed him. Now, I want you to notice this right now, that God said to Cain, like, you know what to do. There's something you can do here. Like let's get past this. There's no need, you know how to fix this. There's no need to make this worse. But then we find that the very first murder, sort of by definition, is the very worst murder. It's first-degree murder. First-degree murder, by definition, is any intentional murder. It's willful and premeditated with malice aforethought. That's your word of the day, aforethought. I don't know how to use it in a sentence other than this, but that's your word. But anyway, so think about this. The first murder is totally premeditated. We find that Cain is angry. Cain is jealous. Cain is hurt. And then he lures his brother out into the field and kills him. Now we would call that first-degree murder today, even thousands and thousands of years later. But if you notice, what it springs out of is very religious, old-fashioned words that are still true as well. Anger, still part of our world, isn't it? Oh my goodness, it's part of our world. Jealousy, that hasn't gone away at all, has it? And rebellion against God. And we're going to talk about this during the series. I mean, this whole thing stems from the idea that God says to Cain and God says to Abel, hey, your gift, the way you're worshiping me is right. And the way you're worshiping me, Cain, even though you have the best intentions, even though you think this is okay, it's not okay. And he rebels against God. And that's still part of our world, isn't it? How many friends do you have? I have friends that go, hey, well, I just want to tell you, man, I choose to worship God this way. And it's like, that's okay as long as God's okay with it. I'm like, I don't know why you're telling me because I'm not in charge. If God's okay with that, that's cool. But realize that worshiping God in your own way, if he's not for it, it doesn't work. And that's called sin. Sin is anything outside of this plan that God has for us. And so here's the aftermath, kind of going through the story. It says, afterward, the Lord asked Cain, where is your brother? Where is Abel? I don't know. Cain responded, am I my brother's guardian? You've probably heard the saying, am I my brother's keeper? That's the old way of saying it. But the Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed, and you're banished from the ground, which has swallowed your brother's blood. No longer will the ground yield good crops for you, no matter how hard you work. From now on, you will be a homeless wanderer on the earth. Isn't it amazing that immediately Cain goes into cover up? He goes into lying to God. I don't know. Am I in charge? I don't know what Abel's doing, right? And it's just sort of silly to us to think of it, but it's all part of this story. It's all part of this thing where he's like, I'm not responsible. I don't take, not me. Talk to my brother. And so in this story, there's this, once again, something that we deal with today, this idea of personal responsibility. And we're going to find that Cain really dislikes it. In fact, Cain's whole story is sort of like he doesn't take personal responsibility ever. But it's interesting to see sort of how God responds because he goes directly to saying, what have you done? What'd you do? So I want you to think of this. God is the witness to the very first murder. That's got to be a bad day in court, right? Can you imagine, like, you're kind of hoping it's some, like, guy that with really, questionable morals that you can impeach their witness. I've watched a few courtroom dramas, Judge Judy. But it's God going on the stand, like, can you put your hand on the Bible? It's about me, but okay, I mean, I'll swear upon myself. It's a bad day. I think all of us would say it's a bad day when God is the witness for the prosecution, and that's exactly what happens here. God saw it. God saw the murder. God calls Cain on it. But it struck me. I was thinking about this, like, it's kind of shocking to think God was the witness to that murder, but God's the witness to every murder. I mean, I can't even imagine sort of what that has to be like. If you love your children and all of God's children, all the people in the world, and God sees every murder, every sin, every hurtful thing that we do to each other, every act of rebellion, and still loves us. It's such an amazing thing to think that this started back then, started with the very first family. And so God gives the sentence to Cain, and Cain replied to the Lord, my punishment is too great for me to bear. You have banished me from the land and from your presence. You have made me a homeless wanderer. Anyone who finds me will kill me. And the Lord replied, no, for I'll give you a sevenfold punishment to anyone who kills you. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain to warn anyone who might kill him. So that's sort of why I speculate, at least, that God created other people, because who was out there to kill Cain if he only had one brother at that point? So Cain left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And you notice this about Cain, kind of the whole story goes like this. He says, you have banished me, and you have made me a homeless wanderer, and you have put me in danger, God. That, in the very first murder crime drama, we sort of find this total lack of taking responsibility. And we still see that today, right? Like, we still do that today. when we are punished, we don't have to be punished, when we receive sort of the results of our actions, how many of us, and I know I have, sort of like shake our fist at God and go, you have done this to me. You have harmed me. You have made me a homeless wanderer. You have put me out of your presence. And it's just sort of our natural way of doing things. And Cain is so clearly here. He still doesn't take responsibility. He blames God for his punishment. But here's the thing, gang, and you know this. If you notice that Cain winds up being separated from the thing he loves, which is the soil, being a farmer, being a provider, and he's totally isolated from his family. And it says that he moves east of Eden. Now, see, that's sort of the result of everything that we do that's sinful. Right? Like it starts out fun. We're like, oh, I can't wait to do that, or oh, I shouldn't, but I will. And then after a while, it's like, I need to do that. And then after a while, it's like, I have to do that. And then we find ourselves sort of separated because of our sin. We find ourselves separated from the people we love and this wall up between us and God. And that's what sin always does. And it's the same story over and over. And the difference between, someone who sort of goes through to the other side and receives forgiveness and starts a new life is whether or not sort of we accept responsibility and go, this is on me, or if we continue to sort of shake our fist at God and others and go, you did this to me, even though it's clearly the results of Cain's actions. And so that's the case. That's the case of the first murder. This shocking thing that we sort of just in our scriptures, and I remember like as a kid reading Bible stories about it, and like somehow, Cain murders his brother and it still seems like a happy ending. I don't know. It's just weird. We sort of bypass this violent, horrible thing in the very, very first family. But here's the thing I was thinking, that there's a little Cain in all of us. In fact, I was sort of thinking about this story and I was like going, the guy I don't relate to is Abel. I mean, good news in the fact that he was murdered pretty early in the story, not a big part of the story. But I mean, think about it. Abel does the right thing. Abel honors God. Abel's the brother that you hate and want to kill. Wait a minute, I am turning into Cain. But like literally, Abel does everything right. But I can relate to Cain, and I think there's a little Cain in all of us. I mean, there's a little bit of sort of like being angry when someone else does the right thing and we don't, right? You feel that? Like sometimes like, oh, and we might say, oh, they're so good, or that brother or that coworker that seems to always do the right thing, and you're not plotting their murder right now, but there's a little bit of joy when something bad happens to them because there's a little bit of Cain in all of us. There's a little bit of rebellion. In fact, there's a lot of rebellion against God where we go, who are you to tell me that I have to worship you that way? Who are you to tell me that my way of living is wrong and his way is right? And who are you to tell me? And so there's a lot. And I don't know about you, but I see a lot of Cain in myself with lack of personal responsibility. So many times that I've blamed God and others for things that just happened to me, throw the air quotes in, and they didn't just happen to me. I'm the one who caused them. I'm my biggest enemy. But I want to sort of end with this. Not this, because this would be really, really depressing. Like, most of you are sinners. You're like, well, you're all sinners, but you're mostly like Cain, and you'll probably murder someone. That's not the way I want to end this. I was thinking about this. There's something so hopeful in this story, and we sort of scooted right past it, and I've scooted past it a million times as I read this account. And it's this, and here's what I want to leave you with today, because it's very powerful. God says to Cain, God says to this person who is obviously on the wrong path, right? Like we would say right there that he's rebelling against God. He's sort of arguing with God. He doesn't take responsibility. He wants to do things his own way like most of us do. God says to him, you'll be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. Now that part, not too encouraging. Basically what that part says is this. That part says that like, hey, guess what? You're only one sin away from planning a murder plot. You know, it's like, that is sort of the frightening reality that if we are honest with ourselves is true. Like, I have this family, I have this job, I have this position, I have this sort of relationship, I have this reputation, but I'm only a few sins away from blowing all of it. And that's the thing. If you're honest with yourself, all of you would say that. Like, I could easily destroy anything good I have in my life in just a couple of moves. We all have that. And that's what God is saying to him. There's sin crouching at your door. Like, I set reminders for everything. I have never had to set a reminder to sin. Like, remember to sin tomorrow, Don. You're going to get busy and you're going to forget to sin. It never happens because sin is always like waiting there. What a perfect picture God painted of like, you walk out your door, and it's waiting for you every time. And all of us, if we're honest, we're like, man, just a few, and you could call it bad decisions, you could call it mistakes. I don't think they're mistakes because we don't plan mistakes, but they're sins. We can all like a couple bad decisions away from ruining everything. And that's a scary reality. You know, I think one of the reasons maybe we're so fascinated with murderers and murder, and the reason why it's in our culture and in our entertainment, is there's a part of us that sort of wonders like, well, what would cause someone to do that? I can't imagine that. And the answer is what God said, sin. Because just a few things. Notice, it wasn't that Cain one day just woke up and went out and like knocked his brother's head off. Instead, he got angry, and it says he planned it. I mean, it basically says one day he brought him out. We don't know how long that day was, but I bet it wasn't the next day. In fact, it doesn't say it's the next. I bet it was a long period of getting angry, getting resentful, building up this case against his brother. So that's really depressing. I'm sorry about that. Like, it just keeps getting worse. But notice this one thing. God says to Cain, God says to the first murderer, the guy who invented murder. So, you know, put that on your resume. By the way, I got this mark. I invented murder. That's, you know, it's not good to get a job, but it is pretty amazing when you think about it. But he said, you, Cain, must subdue sin and be its master. See, I was thinking about that. I was like, oh my goodness, that's so hopeful. Like, it didn't happen. Cain totally did the wrong thing. Yes, we understand that. We can look back in history. But God said to Cain, like, you could stop this now, because a lot of us struggle with that, right? Like, what is free will? And as I'm born this way, you know, like I have this thing in me and boy, I want to do this thing. And God says it's wrong, but Cain was just born to be a murderer, not according to this. In fact, God says, sin is crouching outside your door, but Cain, you could stop it. You could subdue it. And in fact, I think it's the most hopeful thing I've ever read. You could be sin's master. I mean, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? Like, not if we were just sort of slave to sin, because all of us get to that point if we're sinners like I am, if we've gone against God's law, where you actually, sin becomes your master. That thing that you used to want to do, you have to do. So I want the band to come back up here. But I want to leave you with this first, because whatever situation you're in, whatever sort of road you're going down, this says that even if you were Cain, even Cain, the very first murderer, God says you'll be accepted if you do what is right. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. We would all say that's true if we're honest. But it gives us this hopeful thought and this hopeful truth, because God said it and it's true. But you could subdue it and you can master it. You don't have to be the slave. So I want to leave you with that. And I want to pray for you. Because here's the deal, guys. I really didn't start this series because I think a lot of you are plotting murder. Maybe a few of you. Probably against me, maybe. So maybe that'll head that off at the bat. Now, that's not true. But I just realized as I read this and I sort of hear the stories and people come and go, hey, you'll never believe what happened. And I kind of go, oh, I totally believe what happened. That we're all just sort of a few bad decisions away from, oh my goodness, just ruining our lives. But this story, I love the fact that this story says, oh, no. We're not destined to do the wrong thing. We're not the bad seed. We're not just born to be bad. But there's hope. And so let's pray. Dear Jesus, God, we are so thankful, not just for the forgiveness of sin. I mean, that's amazing. Like we all sin and we all need forgiveness and we all need mercy and we all need second chances. But God, just this hopeful statement that you gave to Cain that, yes, sin is crouching and sin is stalking each one of us, but we could actually be its master. God, that's the most amazing thing I think I've read this week. And God, I pray for everyone and sort of every step of their life. And God, right now there are people that are in the middle of a very bad series of decisions, and there are other people who are trying to think like, should I just keep going because it just seems to be going? I just pray that you would stop them right now, and that they would begin to think like, man, there's a possibility that I could turn this around by the grace of God. God, we love you, and we thank you for your forgiveness even when we do all the wrong things. In your name we pray. Amen.